I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. The American book ecosystem is comprised of many different types of publishers. All these outfits devoted to getting works of fiction and nonfiction out there into the world in front of potential readers. You have small presses with tiny staffs publishing up-and-coming authors and sometimes experimental works. You have academic presses that focus on niche pieces of nonfiction or sort of books of deep scholarship. And then you have the Big Five. These are the large companies that put out most commercial books in this country. Most of the well-known or best-selling authors that you hopefully are familiar with. There's Penguin Random House, Hachette, HarperCollins, Macmillan, and Simon and Schuster. That last one, S&S, is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And on this week's show, I'm joined by Jonathan Karp, the CEO and publisher of Simon and Schuster, to talk about the company's history as well as its future. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I saved the hardest question for first. You have to pick your favorite book from the century-long history of Simon and Schuster.
Oh, God.
There are a lot of them.
There are a lot of them. I'm just going to pluck one out right now. The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker.
What a great way to start a Wednesday. Tell me about The Denial of Death.
Because I read it years ago before I ever worked at Simon & Schuster, and it really made me think about mortality in a different way. It made me realize that we're always thinking about it on a subliminal level, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. We just, in fact, published a 50th anniversary edition, so it's halfway through the centennial. So it just comes to mind. I mean, I could give you a more predictable one like All the President's Men by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, which I think defines the way that journalists cover politics and certainly gave investigative journalism real voice in the culture.
And you still work with Woodward, is this correct?
I am still Bob Woodward's editor. Well,
all
actually,
right.
I mean, and I didn't edit All the President's Men.
No,
I'm not that old.
Yeah.
I mean, and Alice Mayhew was his champion for decades, and Bob has been with us for over 50 years.
I was going to ask this question later in the conversation, but I'm going to ask now. You are the CEO of Simon & Schuster. You are the publisher of Simon & Schuster, and yet you're also still editing books.
Every now and then I do a few books, and they've got to be really compelling to me.
Okay, we'll get to that. So Simon & Schuster, it's 2024, started in 1924. I actually have a prop here, which is a New York Times Book Review ad about Simon & Schuster's first bestseller, which was a crossword puzzle book. And maybe, much like today with the New York Times, games are very lucrative. And this this crossword puzzle book was, in some ways, the thing that launched the company.
It was a startup 100 years ago. It was two guys in their 20s, Richard Simon and Max Schuster. They were just a couple of guys who loved books. And they made a decision that they wanted to read every book they published. They wanted to only publish books they were enthusiastic about. It was just them and a stenographer. And they had $4,000 of their own money that they invested. The first book was a crossword puzzle book. It was a monster success. They'd actually raised $50,000 from their friends and family. They didn't need it. They returned the money, and the company was up and running. And from that beginning, we have over 36,000 books in print. We publish over 1,000 books a year, and it all emerged from that very basic impulse that Simon and Schuster had to publish books that were interesting to them.
Simon & Schuster has published this sort of 100-year history book. I think a lot of people inside the company have access to it. It goes through 100 books. It talks really in depth about the history. And you wrote a foreword, and you quote someone saying, the main reasons that people buy books are for pleasure or for information. That was something that was said almost 100 years ago. I wonder if that's still what you think books are for. Pleasure or information?
Richard Simon said that, and I think it's still true. And it's kind of amazing that given how much has changed in the world, I do think that those are basic impulses, entertainment or enlightenment. And books speak to those basic impulses.
I think for many readers, they possibly have no idea who publishes what.
Correct.
So maybe they notice the logo on the spine. I don't really know what it matches to. But there are several big American publishers, as I mentioned, and more importantly, within each publisher, there are often many imprints. At Simon & Schuster alone, you have Atria, you have Gallery, you have Scribner, you have Simon & Schuster itself, which is somewhat confusing because it's an imprint, but it shares the company name. I'd love for you to explain to our listeners what it is that a publisher tries to do, aside from maximizing profit, of course, when it comes to carving out an identity. What do these things mean? What does it mean to see Simon & Schuster on the side versus a competitor? How does a publisher define itself in that way?
Well, you have to think that since we can't read all 1,000 books we publish, you have to you have to break down into smaller groups. And so we have over 50 imprints because we want those imprints to be deciding what to publish. And within each imprint, there's a publisher, there are editors, there are publicists and marketing people, designers, and they decide what they want to publish. And the smaller groups each have a sensibility, just as any organization has a sensibility. You want those smaller groups to put their sensibility out into the world through the books that they publish. And so Scribner, which has a great tradition of literary excellence, the publisher of Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Edith Wharton, and latter-day authors such as Anthony Doerr and so many others, Don DeLillo, they have Jeanette Walls. They've really distinguished themselves for literary memoirs. Frank McCourt's another example. So Scribner has a reputation for excellence in literary memoir, in fiction of the highest quality. Then Atria is a much broader, more commercial publishing imprint, and they love books that people can't stop reading, that you're turning the pages to, and they have thrillers and books that are romantic. And Simon and Schuster, the flagship imprint, has a long tradition for topical nonfiction and books about politics and history. And that's where Bob Woodward and Walter Isaacson and David Marinis and so many other top journalists have been published through the years.
Going through the 100-year history of Simon & Schuster, one of the things that stuck out to me the most was something that happened right around the time the Second World War started, which was that S&S established pocketbooks, which was, and correct me if I'm missing part of this, the first mass market paperback publisher. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about pocketbooks.
Well, first of all, it's exactly what it sounds like. It was portable. You could fit it in your pocket, and it was affordable. So it basically democratized reading for a mass market audience. It's the equivalent of what's happening now with streaming TV, where you're paying less to get more. And so there was a migration of books into this format. Many more people were buying these books, and authors were getting paid larger sums of money because more people were buying their books. So it was good for authors.
And how do you think about paperbacks now? What is the lifespan of a book when it comes to how long it's out in hardcover? When is the right time to put out a paperback?
Well, paperbacks they're still a very important part of the economy. And recently we had this phenomenal success with Colleen Hoover, who has been published almost entirely in paperback. She was not a hardcover author, so her books came out first in paperback. It was a lower price point. Paperbacks have tended to appeal to younger readers, and that's certainly been true of Colleen Hoover. There were a lot of people younger. They tended to be women. Although, actually, I should stop myself because we did some market research and we found that a large percentage, like maybe 30% of her readers were men, which was very interesting to see because they are largely very romantic books.
That's not a small number.
Yeah. So 30%'s a lot. And anyway, that's a digression. The point is that she broke out in paperback. Now, what's happened recently in the marketplace is that readers are buying in all formats. So the fastest growing format is actually audio, which I think this podcast is perhaps an example of. Ebooks are still very popular. Perhaps about 25% of the people are reading ebooks. Perhaps 25% of them are buying audiobooks. And then maybe 50% of the readers are still buying printed books, and they're reading in hardcover and paperback.
I think at least one who works in books maybe, hears very often about an editor's gut or a publisher's instinct. And I'm curious, as someone who has been in Simon Schuster for a while, worked at other places beforehand, what do you think that actually means when it comes to making these big decisions? Maybe deciding to pay a ton of money for an author, you go through years of holding that author's hand, and potentially, if that author is lucky, you as a publisher, as a publishing house, are spending money on marketing and publicity to tell people about that book. What does the gut tell you? How do you develop that gut? What do you have the instinct or you don't?
I think that every reader has that instinct. And let me give you, first of all, one editor said that he begins to vibrate when he gets excited about something. And I thought that was a good analogy. Can I give you an example of gut?
Absolutely.
So there's a memoir that's coming out. Actually, it's coming out right now, and it's a memoir, the most extraordinary account I have ever read of a mother's love for her children. It actually grew out of a piece that first appeared in the New York Times. It was a modern love piece, and it was a story written by a woman whose mother had terminal cancer. She was a girl when her mother was diagnosed. She was only 3 or 4 years old, and her mother lived another 8 years. And her mother had the time and the presence of mind to leave her daughter notes up to the age she was 30, and a present for each birthday, and notes on her marriage and on her graduations. And the daughter grew up and wrote this book. And when you read it, the mother lives in this book in a way that is so inspiring and so interesting. And you see this mother leaving breadcrumbs for her daughter to figure out who she was and the life she lived. And it's one of the most moving memoirs I've ever read. I cried about 7 times when I read it, and I'm not a crier. And this was a book that set everybody off. There were about 10 publishing imprints that all wanted to buy this book. And the editor who prevailed is a woman named Mary Sue Rucci. She's one of our best editors. She has the gut. Some people call it the nose. She's just got it. And when people read this book, it affects them on a visceral level. It's called Did I Ever Tell You? The writer's name is Genevieve Kingston. And I think that that's an example of gut. Why did 10 publishing imprints all want to acquire this book? Why am I going on and on about it when I read probably hundreds of books a year? Why am I talking about Did I Ever Tell You? Because it just has that quality. And I know people are going to love it when they read it.
How many books do you read a year?
Well, I read hundreds, but I don't know how many. And I don't read every word of every book. I mean, there are some books that they grab you from the first sentence. There are other books that you can get the point of by reading only parts of them. There's some books that really demand to be read, and I try very, very hard to read those.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined this week by Jonathan Karp, the CEO and publisher of Simon and Schuster, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Jonathan, before we get into a couple more questions about publishing business, I'd love for you just to tell us about some other books from the 100-year history of S&S that you're particularly passionate about.
All right, well, I'll start with a children's book because it's fun.
Okay.
How about Chicka Chicka Boom Boom?
I think I read that to my child.
You cannot say Chicka Chicka without saying Boom Boom.
Boom Boom.
Actually, I'll give you the most recent book. The last book, the 100th book, is a book that just won the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography, How to Say Babylon, by a beautiful, electric new author named Sophia Sinclair. And I love that book. I think that Frederick Douglass by David Blight, an award-winning historian, this was 10 years in the works. This was a book we knew was going to be great and is the definitive work on Frederick Douglass.
Can I ask you a question actually about that? When you have an author, and they're famous authors that are other publishing houses like Robert Caro, who, you know, when you sign them up, it's going to take them a very long time to turn their book in. It's almost certainly going to be a good one, but it's going to take them quite a while. What is as someone who used to edit more books than you currently do, how do you keep that author going? How do you not transfer your anxiety about when is the book coming out to that author? What is that like to wait for something for so long?
Well, first of all, I don't think any author intends to take a long time. It sometimes just happens. But I actually have come to believe that the books that take longer are often the best, because the one quality that books will always have over every other medium is distillation, compression of time, the perspective that a writer brings to the work. And those are qualities that make books special. That's what makes a book last. And so I don't think it's ever a good idea to rush a writer, except when a book is really relevant to the moment. Obviously, we've got an election coming up in November, and there are definitely some books that we're going to be publishing between June and October that we think could have an influence on the way people think about who they want to vote for. We consider that part of our mission to provide the public with perspective. And those books really do need to come out right away. But there are a lot of other books where if you're expecting a historian to really study the subject and figure out what happened and to provide context, this is something that AI is never going to be able to do. You need to read a particular writer in order to understand and parse what happened.
We are in an election year, and the last cycle, S&S had pretty massive successes when it came to Trump books, but it feels like the reader energy or excitement for some of those political books has fallen off. I'm curious whether or not you think there's a waning appetite for political books, given that we're back in a contest with people that we are quite familiar with.
I think it's as important now as ever, and we're trying to find different ways to cover it. Some of the books we've published are very much of the moment. We're publishing Bill Maher in a couple of months. What This Comedian Said Will Shock You. And this is a book that I think Bill Maher he's a comedian, but I actually think that you're going to find more relevant information in this comedian's account of what's been happening in the country than almost any other book. He's got, I think, an original perspective on what's going on in the culture. And I think he's very much in the tradition of somebody like Mark Twain or Will Rogers. And so that's one way of getting at it. Ezra Klein, Why We're Polarized. This is an older book, but obviously we need to understand why we're polarized. And I think that Ezra has actually written the signal book on that topic. So there are lots of ways. We'll definitely have political leaders coming out with books. We just announced that we're publishing Gretchen Whitmer's new book. It's called True Gretch.
Saw that.
And we have some other surprises that haven't been announced yet. But we think that a multitude of voices are going to illuminate a decision that some people still have not yet made. I know that everybody says people have made up their minds about who they're going to vote for, but there are a lot of people who haven't, and there are also some people who aren't yet focused on it. And maybe they'll read one of our books 3 weeks before they vote. That would be a great thing. We'd like to make that kind of contribution.
I would be negligent if I didn't ask you a couple questions about this interesting position your company finds itself in. You took the job as CEO during the first year of the pandemic, very hard time. You took it following the unexpected passing of the company's previous CEO, and you were immediately thrown into this attempt by your owner at the time, Paramount, to offload S&S through a merger with Penguin Random House. Penguin Random House is the nation's largest publisher. It's itself owned by a German conglomerate, Bertelsmann. The government sued to halt the merger. There was a trial in which you had to testify. And then a ruling came down. It happened on Halloween, I remember, because I had to run inside from trick-or-treating to help edit the story. Ruling came down blocking the deal. Subsequently, S&S was then bought by the very large private equity firm KKR. This is the seventh owner that Simon and Schuster has had since it was first sold in 1944 to Marshall Field, the department store magnate. Has this been different so far from your previous owner, Paramount? And what do you think the next few years look like underneath this firm, KKR, that is a very unique owner?
Well, I believe this was the best outcome for Simon and Schuster. We haven't had to fire anybody, which probably would have happened if we'd been bought by one of our competitors. We are independent again in the way the OG Simon and Schuster were. We're our own publishing company. We're a pure play publishing company. And we are also, for the first time in decades, able to invest back into our company rather than returning our profits to the parent owner at the end of the year. So we are investing in ourselves. We're expanding. We're thinking more internationally. We're hiring new editors. We're going into new categories. We're doing more science fiction and fantasy. We're doing more books for Latinos. We started doing poetry. I mean, we're doing everything that our editors want to do. It's actually a liberating and exciting time for Simon and Schuster right now.
You mentioned AI, which I think is something that not only in publishing, but really in any creative industry is a source of concern or worry or at least curiosity. Recently, the Times published a blockbuster piece. I think I can call it that because it had 5 amazing reporters on it about tech companies and their attempts to harvest intellectual property, harvest data in order to train their AI systems on. And we reported that Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, had discussions about buying Simon & Schuster in order to gain access to the books published. There's this fear, authors, publishers, that these systems are just going to hoover up all this imaginative writing and then use it to produce stuff that is absolute crap. When you think about artificial intelligence and you have conversations in your building about what the next couple of years look like, how are you thinking through this?
Well, first of all, I want to just commend the New York Times on this reporting, and it was really quite an experience for me. So Saturday morning, I was eating my breakfast and reading the New York Times, as I do every morning, and I'm eating my grape nuts, and there in the New York Times, I see that Meta was interested in buying Simon & Schuster, and this was total news to me. I had no idea that this conversation had been going on. The story was quoting private conversations that nobody knew about. And this really was news to everybody. And I've checked. Nobody knew that this happened.
So you immediately start sending emails to all of your executives.
Yes, I said, Dave,
read the story.
Did you see this? So this is extraordinary. And they did not obviously pursue it. It didn't get far. These were the biz dev people at Meta who were doing this. And so instead, I guess they just decided to steal everything. And obviously, I think we are a company that publishes great writers. I hadn't really thought that we published great data, but I suppose we do. And it's funny because if you think about it, the books it's kind of like, I'm going to go for a metaphor here and say that, let's say books are like the cement that is a foundation for these LLMs that are the basis for all this generative AI. If the books are that cement, we're the cement maker. And you can't steal the cement. You just can't do that. So it's infringement, it's wrong, and presumably the courts will step in. And I guess we just have to be patient. We are a nation of laws. So I look forward to seeing those laws enforced.
You used to work at a publisher called 12. The motto of that publisher is publishing 1 book a month. We live in this world, and this world has existed for a long time, in which there are many books. There are many books published every year. We review a lot of them, though not nearly as many come out. And one of the things that we think about at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm sure publishers think about this in a different way, is how are readers finding our books? And I imagine one of the fears with artificial intelligence, at least, is that if you have something that's just able to flood the market even more, then maybe that makes what is called discoverability even more difficult than it is right now. What have you heard from authors or agents about what they're concerned about when it comes to AI?
Well, first of all, I'll point out, just in defense of some AI, that you could argue that the AI could make discoverability easier. I certainly think that certainly a lot of these online platforms, whether it's Spotify or Amazon, are using AI to help us find books. I think we see that on Netflix. You can find movies more easily because some of their algorithms work.
Yeah. They're a very robust tagging system.
Right. So it's not all bad. And I think it's a tool like anything else. And I'm not up in arms about that particular threat. I don't think they should steal writers' works, and I think that we should all be able to protect our copyrights. I think that if AI makes our jobs easier because it relieves some of the tedium and some of the repetitive work, then that's probably a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So you edit Bob Woodward, very famous person. Is it just like CEO's privilege? I'm going to pick the one guy that I want to edit. It's going to be this guy. Tell me about working with him.
I'm allowed to have fun too. And Bob Woodward is the greatest. I have known him for a long time. He's one of the reasons I wanted to come to Simon and Schuster in the first place. I actually started my career as a summer intern at the Washington Post, and Bob Woodward came in to speak to us in 1985. So I've been following Bob Woodward's career my whole professional life. So to have the opportunity to work with him after his editor, Alice Mayhew, passed away, why wouldn't I seize that opportunity? He's an extraordinary reporter, arguably the greatest reporter of our time. He finds out what's happening. He finds out what's happening in a what I believe to be a completely honest way. He just goes after his sources. He's been cultivating sources for decades now. People want to talk to him. He asks really smart questions, and he finds out what actually happened. And I don't see an ideological agenda with Bob Woodward. I think he just wants to find out what happened. And there aren't that many authors who can get inside the room and tell you what happened. And what happened, I think, last time in 2020, I was so grateful and privileged to have been able to publish Bob's book, Rage, which showed how the Trump administration handled the COVID crisis and showed how Donald Trump specifically lied about COVID, lied to the American people. And it was extraordinary because this is not me saying that Donald Trump lied. Donald Trump explains why he lied, and he says it to Woodward. And it's right there in the book. It's in the audio book, the Trump tapes, which former President Trump is now suing us about. And it's just all there reported. So this is not opinion. And I think that's a valuable contribution to public understanding. Bob's book with Robert Costa, Peril, was cited in a lot of the January 6th investigations. And that also was a contribution.
As we close out our conversation here, I'd love for you to tell me one more thing that you or people in the publishing industry are maybe worried about, and then one thing that you are excited about as you look to the future.
Well, I think what we worry about is the same thing we've always worried about, which is just how do we make people aware of books when the cacophony of the culture is so loud and there are so many alternatives. And now we have podcasts to compete with too. And so our time is finite. Reading takes concentration. And if I were to worry about one thing, maybe it's just that kids aren't reading enough. Weirdly, the sales of books for middle grade readers are down. And maybe it was the pandemic, maybe it was the book bans, but those sales are down. People don't seem to be, either parents aren't buying as many new books for their kids or kids aren't reading them as much. I don't know. So that's something I worry about. Most of the people in children's publishing who I talk to think it's cyclical and that it'll come back, and all it takes is another Harry Potter or something like that. So that's what I worry about. I think what I'm excited about, actually, one of the things I'm excited about is audio. I think that the idea that audio can reach so many more readers. And you can do it. You can multitask with audio, so you can absorb a book while you're driving or while you're exercising or while you're taking a walk. And that part of the audience is growing, and it's growing dramatically. And think about it. We know that only about half of the U.S. population is buying printed books. So that other 50%, if we can reach them through audio. And now that Spotify's in the game and Audible is doing a great job, that's a really exciting opportunity. Apple, so many people have phones. If they start listening to audiobooks on their iPhones more, that gets books to a vastly greater number of readers. And I think that's a very healthy thing for writers. And also the production of our audiobooks is getting better. And it's like casting a play sometimes. I mean, we did this wonderful book called Our Hidden Conversations by Michelle Norris, and it was based on the wonderful project she did, the Race Card Project, where people told their stories about race in 7 words. And hundreds of thousands of people have submitted their 7-word stories about race. And so our audiobook of Our Hidden Conversations has that multitude of voices there. And you can hear all of these original voices talking about their deepest feelings about race. It's a revelation.
Have you had occasion to sort of peek in on some of these audiobook recording sessions or production sessions?
I wish I had. And in fact, during the pandemic, one of the authors I chose to work with was Jerry Seinfeld. Mm-hmm. And he had to record Is This Anything all by himself in the middle of the pandemic. And this was all of his best comedy, all in one book. It's all of his best bits through decades. And, I wish I'd been able to actually be in the studio when he recorded that, because that really would have been something.
Well, let's set this intention for you here on air that you will do this at least once this year.
Okay.
Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the Book Review Podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Jonathan Karp, CEO and publisher of Simon and Schuster, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.